They said she conjured storms. They said her garden grew things no honest garden should ever grow in November. They said if you crossed paths with her after sunset, you'd wake the next morning burning with fever, and no physician in the county could explain why. None of it was true. Not one word. But the truth has never once prevented frightened people from believing the story that comforts their fear. That night, the Duke rode into Hollow Wood searching for a poacher. Instead, he found a woman kneeling beneath silver moonlight, her hands deep in the cold earth, her dark hair stirred gently by the wind. And when she lifted her face toward him, there wasn't the slightest fear in her eyes. He should have turned his horse around. He should have forgotten she'd ever existed. He didn't. And long before the county finished calling her a witch, he had already decided that if choosing her meant earning every curse England could imagine, he would still choose her every single time. By the time our story begins, the village had already made up its mind about Isolde Blackwood. Nothing she said, nothing she did, and certainly nothing she could ever become was likely to change it. For 11 years she had lived at the edge of Hollow Wood, in the same modest stone cottage where her mother had drawn her last breath, surrounded by the same herb garden that had fed, healed, and sustained generations of families long before anyone thought to fear it. Every morning she rose before sunrise. Every morning she tended the garden. Every morning she worked with the quiet certainty that plants did not care what people whispered about the hands that cultivated them. The rosemary still reached for the light. The lavender flowered when the season allowed. The sage, thyme, chamomile, nettles, and foxglove all answered only to rain, soil, and patience. Nature had never concerned itself with gossip. People, unfortunately, were rather different. Her mother, Margaret Blackwood, had spent 30 years serving Ashfern Hollow as its herbalist and midwife. She had delivered babies when storms made physicians impossible to fetch. She had eased fevers, sat beside dying beds, mixed remedies through endless nights while wealthier gentlemen in London debated medicine from comfortable drawing rooms. Nearly every family in the parish owed Margaret Blackwood something: a safe birth, a recovered child, a peaceful passing. The village had accepted her, not warmly, not lovingly, but with the peculiar sort of reluctant gratitude reserved for people whose usefulness outweighed their discomfort of their differences. They needed her. They simply never trusted her completely. When Margaret died, the work passed quietly to her daughter. The cottage remained. The garden remained. The shelves filled with carefully labeled jars remained. Even the old leather-bound ledger survived, its pages lined with neat handwriting that recorded remedies prepared, debts owed, and promises made over decades. Only one thing failed to pass from mother to daughter: tolerance. If Margaret had been endured, Isolde was merely watched. At first, the change seemed almost too small to notice. A calf born deformed on the Pemberton farm happened to arrive in the same week someone had seen Isolde gathering nettles along the boundary hedge. The two events had absolutely nothing to do with one another. Anyone capable of calm thought could have seen that. But calm thought rarely keeps pace with frightened imagination. Then came the fever. 2 children died within the same month. Weeks earlier, their mother had purchased one of Isolde's cough tinctures. The remedy did precisely what it promised. It eased the cough. Nothing more, nothing less. Other families who used the same preparation recovered perfectly well. Yet grief has an unfortunate habit of searching desperately for explanations. Coincidence seldom satisfies a broken heart. Blame often does. Before long, the stories began finding one another. The calf, the fever, the herbs, the lonely cottage standing just beyond the trees, the unmarried woman living alone where respectable people rarely wandered after dusk. Individually, each story made very little sense. Collected together, they became something else entirely. They became certainty, or at least the sort of certainty frightened people convince themselves is truth. By the 3rd autumn after Margaret's death, Isolde no longer noticed the silence that settled over a room whenever she entered. She had heard it too many times. She no longer noticed mothers calling children quietly to the opposite side of the road, nor the way conversations ended the moment her footsteps approached, nor the careful smiles that never reached anyone's eyes. She noticed, but she no longer allowed herself to react. Grief had already taught her one lesson. Loneliness taught her another. Some battles cannot be won by argument. So she stopped arguing. Instead, she worked. Every morning she walked through the garden, inspecting leaves still wet with dew. She gathered herbs only when they were ready, never early, never late. Her mother had taught her that plants possessed their own seasons, and anyone impatient enough to ignore them had no business preparing remedies for another human being. She dried bundles beneath the cottage rafters, ground roots carefully with an worn stone mortar, measured every mixture with the same steady precision Margaret had insisted upon since Isolde was old enough to recognize one herb from another. Nothing hurried, nothing careless. Illness rarely forgave carelessness, nor did she. When villagers came, and they still came despite everything, they seldom knocked at the front door anymore. Instead, they waited awkwardly near the kitchen entrance, as though accepting help while refusing hospitality somehow balanced the scales of conscience. Isolde never commented. If a frightened father arrived carrying a coughing child, she prepared the medicine. If an elderly widow appeared asking for herbs to ease aching joints, she filled the packet. If payment wasn't possible, she wrote the amount carefully into the ledger. Never once did she deny medicine because someone lacked a few coins. Need mattered more than pride. She did neither. Instead, she regarded him with calm curiosity, as though he were the unexpected visitor, as though he had wandered into her evening rather than the other way around. He found the sensation unexpectedly disarming. "You're trespassing on Ravensworth land." The words left his mouth almost automatically. Yet even as he spoke them, they lacked the authority he had intended. She hadn't moved, hadn't hurried to explain herself, hadn't offered apology or excuse. She simply brushed a little soil from one hand before answering. "I've walked this boundary my whole life." Her voice carried the same calm certainty as her expression. "I wasn't aware Ravensworth's authority extended to what grows wild at the wood's own edge." Nathaniel studied her. "You know who I am." A faint smile touched her face. "Everyone in this parish knows who you are, Your Grace." She looked back down briefly, gently adjusting one of the herbs before continuing. "I'd wager considerably fewer of them know who I am." She paused. "Though I understand they've already decided what to call me." There was no bitterness in the words, no attempt to invite sympathy, only quiet acceptance. That, more than anything else, caught his attention. "And what is it they call you?" He asked the question, despite already suspecting the answer. She met his eyes again. "A witch." The word came simply, without embarrassment, without anger. "Among other things." Another small pause. "I find the accusation considerably less interesting than the fact that nobody troubles to discover whether it's true before repeating it." Nathaniel found himself studying her more carefully. Then, almost without thinking, he swung down from his horse. The decision surprised him nearly as much as it seemed to surprise the horse itself. He gathered the reins loosely in one hand and stepped closer. She was younger than he'd first imagined. Moonlight revealed soil beneath her fingernails and calluses across her hands. Not the hands of someone dabbling in strange rituals. The hands of someone accustomed to honest work. Hands that planted, harvested, lifted, mixed. He looked toward the herbs growing at her knees. "What are you tending that requires moonlight in October?" She glanced down at the plants. "Foxglove doesn't concern itself with the hour." She smiled faintly. "Nor does the moon particularly care whether a frightened village imagines its light makes ordinary work sinister." She carefully loosened another stem from the earth. "I work when the work needs doing, Your Grace. October nights are shorter than they'll admit once winter properly arrives." Nathaniel couldn't help smiling. "You are the herbalist." She nodded once. "Margaret Blackwood's daughter." "I am." Something stirred quietly inside his memory. "I remember your mother." The words emerged more softly than he had intended. "She attended my own mother during her final illness." His gaze drifted briefly toward the moonlit trees. "I remember her hands. They were kind, whatever the village chose to believe about her trade." For the first time, something shifted in Isolde's expression. The careful distance she'd maintained eased, if only slightly. She looked at him with quiet surprise. Very few people remember that. "They remember." She glanced toward the village beyond the trees. "They remember only what they decided to fear." Nathaniel nodded slowly. "I don't imagine you're a witch, Miss Blackwood." A tiny smile returned. "No," she answered gently. "I don't imagine I am either." Then, after a brief silence, she added, "I simply find it makes very little practical difference what either of us believes." She looked toward the distant village lights. "Not when an entire frightened parish has already decided the matter for itself." The honesty of the observation lingered between them. Nathaniel found no easy answer. Instead, he stood quietly beside his horse, listening to the wind move through the branches overhead. The clearing no longer felt mysterious, only peaceful, remarkably peaceful. He realized, somewhat unexpectedly, that he wasn't eager to leave. He had ridden into the woods, searching for a poacher. Instead, he had stumbled into a conversation unlike any he'd shared in years. No ceremony, no expectation, no careful politeness demanded by rank. Just truth, simple, unvarnished truth. At last, he slipped the reins back into one hand. I won't trouble you further tonight." He hesitated, then smiled. "Though I confess, Miss Blackwood, I should be glad to speak with you again. Perhaps under circumstances the village finds rather less suitable for gossip." A hint of amusement flickered across her face. "You may find, Your Grace," she rose slowly, brushing the last traces of soil from her hands, "that the village requires very little occasion at all." Nathaniel laughed quietly. It surprised him. He couldn't remember the last time laughter had arrived so naturally. He inclined his head, then mounted his horse once more. As he turned back toward Ravensworth Hall, he glanced over his shoulder only once. She had already returned to her work. The humming began again, softly, almost as though he had never interrupted it. He rode home beneath the cold October sky, with the melody lingering somewhere at the edge of his thoughts. And for the first time in 2 long years, when he crossed the gates of Ravensworth Hall, his mind carried something besides the familiar weight of grief. It carried the memory of a woman who had looked at a duke beneath the moonlight without the slightest trace of fear. Imagine living in a place where every kindness you offer becomes another reason for people to fear you. Imagine knowing that no matter what you do, they've already decided who you are. And then imagine the one man powerful enough to destroy your life, finding you alone in the woods at midnight. It took less than a fortnight for the story to settle into the shape the village preferred. It always happened that way. A rumor rarely remained uncertain for long. All it needed was the right pair of ears, the right frightened imagination, and someone willing to repeat it with enough confidence that doubt quietly disappeared. The truth, by comparison, rarely traveled half so quickly. It began with Silas Grieve. The shepherd had been walking the eastern edge of his flock one cool evening when he caught sight of 2 figures beneath the trees. Or at least he believed he had.
Even if pride prevented gratitude afterwards, the ledger became her quiet protection. 41 households owed her something that autumn. Some only a few pennies, others considerably more. Every debt appeared in careful handwriting beside names, dates, remedies, and promised repayment. Not because she expected every coin, because records mattered. A woman living without husband, father, or brother quickly learned that memory rarely defended her nearly as well as ink. Her mother had understood that. Now Isolde did too. The pages became evidence, evidence that she had traded honestly, evidence that she had charged fairly, evidence that she had helped people who might one day decide they'd never sought her assistance at all. She hoped never to need those records. Still, she kept them, carefully, faithfully. As autumn deepened, the evenings arrived earlier. Mist lingered over Hollow Wood before sunset. The first hints of frost silvered the edges of cabbage leaves each morning. Foxglove still stood where it always had along the far boundary, its season nearly finished. She gathered the final stems with practiced hands. It was ordinary work, work she'd performed every year since childhood. Nothing remarkable about it, nothing mysterious, nothing that should have interested anyone beyond another herbalist. Yet grief has remarkable eyesight when searching for patterns.
Old Mrs. Ainsworth buried her youngest grandson that August after a fierce summer fever. 3 weeks later, someone remembered seeing Isolde collecting foxglove at dusk. The two memories settled together, not because they belonged together, because loss demanded explanation. Soon, someone repeated the thought aloud. Someone else repeated it again. By September, the whispers no longer hid behind closed doors. The word came plainly. Witch. It wasn't shouted. It didn't need to be. The woman who spoke it once trusted Isolde enough to place 2 newborn children into her waiting hands. Now she looked at her with frightened certainty. Witch. The lane became strangely quiet. Everyone waited, perhaps expecting denial, perhaps anger, perhaps tears. Isolde offered none of them. She looked at the woman for only a moment, then quietly adjusted the basket resting against her arm, turned, and walked home. Not because the accusation hadn't hurt. It had. More deeply than she wished to admit. But she'd already discovered something over the previous 3 years. Reason cannot persuade fear once fear has chosen certainty. Every explanation becomes another argument. Every defense becomes another reason for suspicion. Silence, though lonely, at least belonged entirely to her. So she carried that silence home. She spent the remainder of the afternoon kneeling in her garden as daylight slowly faded across hollow wood. Hands deep in familiar soil, surrounded by plants that never questioned her character. Above her, the sky surrendered quietly to evening. And somewhere beyond the trees, the village continued believing the story it had already chosen. Duke Nathaniel Ashworth had ridden out from Ravensworth Hall that October night for reasons that had far less to do with any rumored poacher than he cared to admit. The explanation he offered himself was simple enough. His steward had mentioned that someone had been taking deer from the eastern boundary of the estate, where hollow wood pressed against Ravensworth land. It was reason enough to saddle a horse. But deep down, Nathaniel knew that wasn't why he rode. The truth was harder to name. For 2 years, ever since Eleanor's death, sleep had become an unreliable companion. She had died bringing their son into the world. The child had died with her. And in a single day, Nathaniel had lost both the woman he loved and the heir who would have carried the Ashworth title into another generation. Grief had not destroyed him, it had simply settled over him, like a perfectly tailored coat, always present, always fitting, so well worn that most people no longer noticed it. He managed the estate because it required managing. He attended dinners because society expected him to attend. He signed papers, met tenants, hosted visitors, answered correspondence. He fulfilled every duty expected of a duke. What he did not do, if he could possibly avoid it, was sit alone with his own thoughts. That, more than anything else, explained why he found himself riding beneath a cold October sky instead of lying awake inside Ravensworth Hall. Motion helped. The steady rhythm of a horse beneath him, the sharp night air against his face, the quiet sounds of the countryside. Anything at all, was preferable to another evening spent listening to silence echo through rooms that once belonged to two people. He followed the eastern boundary almost without thinking. Moonlight spilled over the open fields before disappearing beneath the dark canopy of hollow wood. The forest stood perfectly still, almost watchful. He had expected the crack of a branch, the hurried movement of someone fleeing through the trees, perhaps the distant sound of a poacher startled by approaching hoofbeats. Instead, he heard music. Not singing, not words, just a soft, steady humming. Gentle, unhurried. The melody drifted effortlessly through the stillness, clear enough that Nathaniel instinctively drew his horse to a stop. It wasn't the sort of sound one expected to find deep in the woods after midnight. He remained where he was for a long moment, listening. The melody continued, calm, peaceful, without the slightest hint that whoever hummed it feared being discovered. Curiosity quietly replaced caution. He guided his horse between the trees. The branches opened into a small clearing washed in silver moonlight. There, kneeling beside a patch of dark earth, was a woman. Her sleeves had been rolled neatly to her elbows. Both hands disappeared into the soil as she worked with patient familiarity among a cluster of late-season herbs, somehow still thriving despite the advancing cold. She did not appear startled by the sound of hoofbeats. She simply looked up. Their eyes met. Nathaniel expected surprise, perhaps fear. Most people reacted one way or another when confronted by an unexpected stranger in the middle of the night.
The distinction mattered very little once the story began. Distance had a way of blurring certainty. Moonlight could easily turn ordinary conversation into something mysterious. Fear was remarkably gifted at supplying details that had never existed. From where Silas stood, he claimed to have seen the Duke of Ravensworth himself, not riding through the woods, not passing by, standing beside Isolde Blackwood. His horse waited nearby while the two of them spoke together beneath the moonlight. To Silas, that alone was explanation enough. By the time he repeated the story at the alehouse that evening, the details had already begun changing. The Duke had lingered. The woman had smiled. They had stood closer than respectable strangers ought. Nothing extraordinary, nothing improper, yet every retelling quietly reshaped the memory, until even Silas himself might no longer have recognized what he'd originally witnessed. By the next market day, the tale had become something else entirely.
People no longer spoke about a conversation. They spoke about enchantment. The witch had bewitched the duke. Some insisted she had drawn the grieving widower to her with unnatural influence. Others claimed she sought protection. If the most powerful gentleman in the county stood beside her, surely no magistrate would dare move against her. The darker whispers traveled even farther. Perhaps she meant harm. Perhaps gaining the Duke's confidence would grant her access to Ravensworth itself. Perhaps that had always been her intention. No one paused to ask why a woman who had lived quietly for 11 years would suddenly begin weaving elaborate conspiracies beneath moonlight. Fear seldom paused for such questions. It preferred certainty. Isolde heard every word of it before the week was over. Not from the marketplace, not shouted across the village green, but from someone who came to her door carrying kindness instead of suspicion. Mrs. Hale arrived shortly after noon with a small basket tucked over one arm. Fresh bread, still warm from the oven, rested beneath a folded cloth. Yet it wasn't the bread that drew Isolde's attention. It was the woman's face. She looked troubled, deeply troubled. Isolde opened the door before she had a chance to knock. "Mrs. Hale, I hope I'm not disturbing you." "Never." She stepped aside immediately. "Please." The older woman entered slowly, placing the basket on the kitchen table before removing her gloves, one careful finger at a time. For several moments neither spoke. Mrs. Hale seemed to be searching for the gentlest way to begin. Finally she sighed. "They're saying you've bewitched him." The words settled heavily inside the little cottage. Isolde neither flinched nor looked surprised. She only waited. Mrs. Hale hurried on. "I don't believe a word of it. I want you to know that before anything else. I've heard it repeated in 3 different kitchens this week." She shook her head sadly. "I thought you'd rather hear it from someone who wishes you well than from strangers eager to enjoy the telling." A faint smile touched Isolde's face. "You've always been kinder than most." "I try," Mrs. Hale answered quietly. "What actually happened?" Isolde leaned lightly against the table. "I spoke with him once, in the woods." Mrs. Hale nodded. "I rather suspected such much. He asked what I was tending. I answered. There was no enchantment, no secret meeting, no mysterious bargain beneath the moon. A tiny smile appeared despite herself. I fear the conversation was disappointingly ordinary." Mrs. Hale laughed softly. "I imagined it probably was, though I suspect the village prefers its version. They usually do." Silence settled briefly between them. Then Mrs. Hale looked at her with quiet concern. "I believe you, I truly do, but if His Grace chooses to visit again—" She hesitated. "I fear belief may not matter very much." Isolde understood exactly what she meant. 1 meeting could be dismissed. 2 would become confirmation. Not because it proved anything, because frightened people often mistook repetition for evidence. She simply nodded. "I know." Mrs. Hale reached across the table, gently squeezing her hand. "I appreciate that." The older woman smiled sadly. "I wish kindness traveled through this village half as quickly as gossip." "So do I." Nathaniel spent the next several days discovering that forgetting someone proved remarkably more difficult than avoiding them. He buried himself in estate accounts, reviewed tenant leases, walked boundary fields with his steward, attended meetings that ordinarily demanded his full attention. Yet every quiet moment, however brief, his thoughts wandered back to hollow wood, to moonlight, to dark soil beneath careful hands, to a woman who had answered suspicion with calm honesty instead of fear. He told himself he ought to remain away. His visits had already become the subject of idle conversation. Returning would only deepen the damage. Reason said precisely that. His conscience refused to listen. By the fourth morning, he had already made his decision. He would go openly, in daylight, no secrecy, no hidden paths through the woods. If anyone wished to speculate, they would do so regardless. Better honesty than concealment. The autumn sun hung low when Nathaniel guided his horse toward the small stone cottage at the edge of hollow wood. The herb garden spread neatly around it, rows carefully tended despite the advancing season. Bundles of drying plants hung beneath the porch roof. Everything about the place reflected order, patience, care. Before he had barely reached the front gate, then the cottage door opened. Isolde stood waiting. She looked at him with an expression somewhere between resignation and quiet amusement. "Your Grace, I'd ask what brings you here, though I suspect half the parish has already invented an answer." Nathaniel smiled despite himself. Quite possibly. He dismounted. Removing his gloves slowly, he approached the cottage. "I've come because my mother spoke kindly of yours until her final days." The smile faded from his face. "And because these past weeks I've found myself increasingly troubled by what this village has decided to believe about you." She remained silent, listening.
"I've made inquiries," he continued. "I spoke with tenants, workers, families who've known you for years. I searched for evidence, for ruined crops, for mysterious fevers, for anything resembling the stories being told." He looked at her directly. "I found nothing. Nothing beyond ordinary misfortune, ordinary grief, and an extraordinary willingness to blame the nearest woman living alone." The wind stirred quietly through the surrounding trees. Isolde studied him carefully. "You made inquiries," she said at last, "on my behalf." "I did." A longer pause. Then, very simply, "Why?" Nathaniel had asked himself that same question throughout the entire ride. He had considered half a dozen respectable answers: concern, justice, simple fairness. Each one held some measure of truth. None of them held all of it. He looked at her steadily. "Because," his voice softened, "because I find myself thinking of you rather more than a man in my position ought to think about a woman he's met exactly once." He gave the smallest shake of his head. "I decided it would be unfair to continue wondering, especially while the accusations against you grow more dangerous. They're built on almost no evidence. And yet," he glanced briefly toward the village, "they're capable of causing very real harm." The words hung quietly between them. There was no flourish, no practiced charm, only honesty, plain, uncomfortable honesty. Isolde held his gaze for a long moment. 3 years had taught her caution. 3 years had taught her that kindness often arrived carrying hidden obligations. Yet nothing about the Duke's expression suggested calculation, only sincerity. At last she spoke. "You should not be seen here, Your Grace. My intentions won't matter, however honorable they may be." She looked toward the lane. "Your presence alone will convince the village they've been right all along." Nathaniel nodded slowly. "I'm aware. You came anyway." "I did." Again, silence. She asked the question once more. "Why?" This time he answered without hesitation. "Because for 2 years," he looked away briefly before continuing, "I've lived without allowing myself to feel very much at all. I buried myself in work, in responsibility, in routine. It was easier." His eyes returned to hers. "Then I met you, and quite without permission, I discovered I was beginning to feel something again. Hope, curiosity, peace." He wasn't entirely certain which, perhaps all of them. "I find myself remarkably unwilling," he admitted quietly, "to surrender that, simply because frightened people have decided to be cruel." For the first time since he'd arrived, something shifted inside Isolde's carefully guarded composure. Not dramatically, only enough for warmth to soften the distance she'd carried for so long. She looked at him thoughtfully, then glanced once toward the road. A smile, faint but genuine, touched her lips. Then she stepped back from the doorway. "You had best come inside." Nathaniel raised an eyebrow. She answered with quiet amusement. "Before Silas Grieve, or someone equally gifted at observing what isn't actually happening, decides you've spent the entire afternoon standing in my doorway." For the first time in many months, Nathaniel laughed without restraint. And together they disappeared into the little stone cottage, completely unaware that before sunset, half the village would already have another story waiting to be told. I want you to stay with me for a moment, because what happened next became the turning point in everything that followed. Years later, when the county was forced to confront the terrible certainty with which it had judged Isolde Blackwood, people would point to grander moments. They would remember accusations shouted in public. They would remember decisions made in drawing rooms and court offices. They would remember scandal. But they would be wrong. The truth began somewhere much quieter, much gentler. It began with 2 lonely people discovering that conversation had slowly become companionship, and that companionship, almost without either of them noticing, became something neither of them wished to lose. Nathaniel returned the next week, then again the week after that, always in daylight, always openly, never hiding his arrival, never slipping through hollow wood beneath cover of darkness. Each visit came accompanied by some perfectly respectable estate matter. One afternoon he asked which herbs might best ease a tenant's stubborn cough that had lingered well into autumn. Another day he sought his advice regarding an overgrown boundary hedge his steward had neglected for several seasons.
They were honest questions, useful questions. Yet with each passing week they required less invention. The estate matters remained genuine enough, but neither of them pretended for very long that those small concerns were the real reason Nathaniel found himself riding to the cottage so often. He came because he wished to, and gradually that became reason enough. The autumn afternoons settled into a comfortable rhythm. Sometimes they walked together through the herb garden, while Isolde explained which herbs welcomed the shortening days and which required gathering before the first hard frost. Sometimes they remained inside the little stone cottage, where dried bundles of lavender and rosemary hung from the beams above them, while jars of carefully labeled remedies lined the shelves. There was never any hurry to their conversations. Silence rested easily between them. Neither felt obliged to fill every quiet moment with unnecessary words. Nathaniel came to understand the particular shape of Isolde's mind. It was precise, practical, steady. She rarely spoke carelessly. When she offered an opinion, it came only after careful thought. She possessed the remarkable ability to hold grief in one hand and ordinary life in the other, without allowing either to overwhelm the other. She learned that lesson after her mother's death. She continued tending the garden, continued keeping the ledger, continued mixing remedies for people who seldom thanked her. Not because the loss no longer hurt, but because life insisted on continuing whether sorrow approved or not. Nathaniel admired that more than he could easily explain. She, in turn, slowly came to understand the quiet sorrow hidden beneath his polished composure. To the rest of the county, the Duke of Ravensworth appeared entirely recovered.
He managed his estate, attended necessary engagements, spoke courteously, performed every duty expected of him. But Isolde noticed the moments no one else ever saw, the way his expression drifted whenever conversation turned unexpectedly toward children, the long pauses that settled over him whenever Eleanor's name arose, the almost invisible tightening around his eyes whenever someone mentioned the future of the Ashworth line. He had learned to carry grief with elegance. He had not learned to set it down. One gray afternoon in November, rain tapped softly against the cottage windows while they sat opposite one another at the plain wooden table where Isolde prepared her tinctures. Bundles of herbs rested between them. The air carried the comforting scent of sage and chamomile. Nathaniel watched her carefully, sorting dried leaves before speaking. "I used to think," his voice was thoughtful, "that grief simply ended." She looked up. He gave a small, almost embarrassed smile. "I imagined a man eventually woke one morning and discovered it gone, like a fever finally breaking." He shook his head slowly. "I understand now that isn't how it works." The rain continued quietly outside. "It doesn't disappear." He looked toward the window. "It simply changes shape." Another pause. "Until it no longer occupies every room inside a person's thinking." Isolde remained silent for a moment before answering. "Grief doesn't end." Her voice was gentle. "It simply stops being the only thing left standing." She carefully set another bundle aside.
Eventually, she looked back at him, something else grows beside it, something strong enough to share the same ground. Nathaniel held her gaze. The words lingered between them. Then, very quietly, "Is that what's happening?" His voice scarcely rose above the sound of the rain. Something growing beside it? For several long moments, neither of them moved. Isolde's hands rested motionless above the herbs she'd been sorting. She studied him with the same honesty she'd offered from the very beginning. "I think," a faint smile appeared, "it might be." She drew a slow breath. "For both of us." Another brief silence. "Unless I've badly misunderstood the reason you've continued visiting these past weeks." Nathaniel answered immediately, "You haven't." There was no hesitation, no uncertainty, only truth. Slowly, he reached across the table. His hand found hers among the scattered herbs. Warm fingers lightly closed around her own. It was the gentlest touch imaginable, almost tentative, as though he wished to offer comfort without presuming the right to it. Isolde looked down briefly at their joined hands. She did not pull away. She understood exactly what this meant. She also understood exactly how dangerous it had become. Not because either of them had done anything dishonorable, but because kindness was already enough to provoke suspicion. Affection would invite something far worse. A faint smile touched her lips. "They'll say I've bewitched you properly now," she spoke softly, "if anyone happens to see this." Nathaniel's thumb brushed lightly across the back of her hand. "Let them," he met her eyes. "I find I care considerably less about what frightened people choose to whisper." His voice softened. "Than I care about what you've given me." She waited. "For 2 years," he continued, "I've carried silence everywhere I went. I thought it belonged to me forever." A small smile appeared. "These past weeks," he looked around the warm little cottage, "you've made that silence feel like something a man might finally be permitted to set down." The words settled gently between them. Neither of them realized at that very moment how impossible it had become to protect what was quietly growing between them. Outside, life continued exactly as it always had. A cart rolled slowly along the lane, wind stirred the last autumn leaves, and a woman named Martha Grieve happened to be walking past the cottage on an entirely ordinary errand of her own. She had no intention of spying, no reason to linger. Yet as she passed the low front window, she glanced inside. Only for an instant. It was enough. She saw the Duke seated across the table. She saw his hand resting over Isolde's. She saw the look they exchanged. Nothing more, nothing improper, nothing that deserved scandal. But by the time she reached home, the story had already begun changing. By the following morning, it belonged to the village, and by the next market day, it belonged to everyone. The witch had finally bewitched the dupe, so the whispers declared. This time there could be no mistake. She had used some darker power to capture the affection of a grieving widower. Some claimed she sought protection against the parish's growing anger. Others imagined ambitions far grander. If she gained influence over Ravensworth, who could possibly predict what harm might follow? Each retelling grew darker, each certainty became stronger. No one paused to ask whether simple kindness might explain what they had witnessed. Fear preferred enchantment. It always had. Old Mrs. Ainsworth listened to every new version with growing conviction. The sorrow she still carried for the grandson she'd buried years earlier had never truly left her. Instead, it had quietly waited for another explanation to cling to. The rumors offered exactly that. What once was suspicion hardened into certainty. By week's end, Mrs. Ainsworth no longer believed whispers were enough. Someone, she decided, needed to act. And so, gathering every accusation she'd carried in her heart since that first terrible loss, she walked directly to the parish magistrate, not merely with gossip, but with a formal accusation she believed, with all the certainty grief could manufacture, would finally bring Isolde Blackwood to justice. The summons arrived on a bitterly cold morning in early December. Frost still clung to the edges of the herb garden when the knock came at Isolde's door. She had been gathering dried rosemary from the rafters when she heard it. 3 measured knocks. Nothing hurried.
Nothing uncertain. She crossed the small cottage and opened the door to find a parish constable standing on the threshold. His uniform was neat. His boots were damp with the morning frost. In one gloved hand he carried a folded document sealed with the magistrate's mark. He looked everywhere except at her. "Miss Blackwood." His voice sounded rehearsed. "I've been instructed to deliver this summons." She accepted the paper quietly. "Thank you." The constable cleared his throat before continuing. "I am also required," his eyes dropped briefly to the written order, "to read the formal charge aloud." For the first time, he looked at her. Only briefly. There was discomfort in his expression, almost embarrassment, as though he understood exactly how little he wished to be standing there. Witchcraft. The word settled heavily in the cold morning air. He continued reading. The accusation relied upon statutes that still existed within the county's records, though few living people had ever imagined they might again be used. The charge named the death of Mrs. Ainsworth's grandson. It listed 3 separate incidents involving livestock across the parish. Then came what the document described as its strongest evidence: the unnatural influence Miss Isolde Blackwood was alleged to exercise over His Grace, the Duke of Ravensworth. Several witnesses, it declared, stood prepared to testify that they had personally observed such influence. When the constable finished, silence returned. Only the wind moved through the bare branches surrounding the cottage. Isolde lowered her eyes to the folded document. She read it once, slowly, carefully. Then, without haste, she read it again. Every word remained exactly the same. Her hands did not tremble, not once. If anyone had been watching closely, they might have noticed only one change. Something inside her had gone remarkably still. Not empty, not broken, simply quiet. 3 years earlier, standing beside her mother's grave, she had made herself a promise. She would not allow this village the satisfaction of watching her fall apart.
She had kept that promise, through whispers, through suspicion, through loneliness. Now, standing in her own doorway, holding an accusation of witchcraft written against her name, she discovered the promise remained unbroken. She folded the summons neatly, looked back at the constable. "I understand." He nodded awkwardly. "I'm sorry." The apology escaped almost before he realized he'd spoken it. She offered him the faintest smile. "I know." He touched the brim of his hat, then turned and walked back toward the waiting horse without another word. Nathaniel received her message less than an hour later. He arrived so quickly that his horse still carried foam along its neck from the hard ride across the estate. He scarcely waited for the stable rail before striding toward the cottage. The moment Isolde opened the door, he knew. She hadn't needed to explain. The folded summons resting upon the table said everything. He picked it up, read the opening lines. His jaw tightened, then tightened again. By the time he reached the final page, the quiet composure she had always admired in him had given way to unmistakable anger. "This is absurd." The words came low, controlled, yet every syllable carried restrained fury. "I'll go to the magistrate myself." He looked directly at her. "I'll make it perfectly clear there's no substance to any of this." Isolde remained calm. "I know you would, and I appreciate it." She waited until his breathing slowed before continuing. "But you must think carefully before you do." Nathaniel frowned. "What is there to think about?" She stepped closer. "If you appear before the magistrate in my defense," she paused gently, "what will the village believe?" He opened his mouth to answer, then stopped. She continued quietly. "They already claim I've bewitched you. If the Duke of Ravensworth arrives furious on behalf of a woman they've accused of enchantment," she met his eyes, "they'll believe they're being proven right." Nathaniel turned away briefly. Frustration flashed across his face. "I cannot simply stand aside while they accuse you of witchcraft." "I'm not asking you to." Her voice remained steady. "I'm asking you to help me properly." He looked back at her. "Properly?" "With evidence," she nodded. "With reason, not with outrage. A raised voice from a duke might silence people for a day." She gently placed her hand upon the summons. "It will not silence fear. It may even strengthen it." Nathaniel remained silent. Every instinct urged action, immediate action, yet somewhere beneath the anger he recognized the wisdom in her words. She wasn't asking him to do nothing, she was asking him to fight differently. At last he exhaled slowly. "What do you need?" A faint smile appeared. "The truth." The days that followed became some of the busiest Isolde had known since her mother's death. She did what she had always done whenever life threatened to overwhelm her. She worked, not in the garden, not among the herbs, but with ink, paper, and the careful habits her mother had spent years teaching her. She opened every ledger, every notebook.
Every bundle of records preserved across decades. Patiently, methodically, she began writing. Each household appeared by name, each remedy, each illness, each payment received, each debt still outstanding. Every tincture sold on credit, every child treated,
every fever observed. Nothing escaped the record. Then she opened Margaret Blackwood's older ledgers, 30 years of careful entries, the same disciplined handwriting, the same remarkable precision. Side by side, mother and daughter's records revealed something impossible to ignore. The illnesses blamed upon Isolde occurred no more frequently than those recorded long before anyone had whispered the word witch. Children caught fevers, livestock sometimes died, harvests occasionally failed, not because of curses, because life had always contained misfortune. Coincidence only became conspiracy after fear began arranging the facts. She organized every page, cross-referenced every entry, labeled every season, every date, every family, until the evidence spoke with quiet clarity. Then she wrote another letter. This one traveled beyond Ashburn Hollow. It was addressed to Dr. Aldous Fenn, the county physician. Years earlier, he had occasionally consulted with Margaret Blackwood on difficult cases. Unlike many gentlemen trained in London, Dr. Fenn had never dismissed practical herbal knowledge simply because it came from village women rather than university halls. He respected Margaret, and by extension, he respected the daughter she'd trained. When her letter reached him, he read every page, every ledger, every carefully assembled record. Several days later, his reply arrived. Brief, direct. He agreed to appear, not out of friendship nor sympathy, but because the evidence supported exactly what she claimed. Her remedies reflected sound medical practice, nothing more, nothing less. Nathaniel, meanwhile, honored the promise he'd made. He did not storm into the magistrate's office. He did not attempt to use rank to silence accusation. Instead, he quietly began gathering evidence of his own. He commissioned a proper investigation. Every claim against Isolde received careful examination. The Pemberton Cath, a veterinary surgeon, inspected the surviving records surrounding the difficult birth. His conclusion proved straightforward. The deformity resulted entirely from complications during delivery. Nothing suggested outside influence of any kind. Next came the Ainsworth boy. Parish records revealed 3 additional children had suffered remarkably similar fevers during that same summer. 2 lived, 1 did not. None of those households had received treatment from Isolde before illness began. The pattern became unmistakable. Disease had followed ordinary paths, not supernatural ones. Piece by piece, the accusations weakened, not because anyone wished them weaker, because honest examination refused to support them. Still, Nathaniel understood what Isolde already knew. Facts alone seldom erased fear. 3 years of whispered certainty could not disappear overnight. Evidence could challenge suspicion. It could not instantly replace it. Yet it accomplished something equally important. It gave the magistrate another choice. Sir Aldous Whitmore had accepted the complaint reluctantly from the very beginning. He was neither reckless nor eager for spectacle. He understood the seriousness of formal accusation. Now, as reports, medical testimony, estate investigations, and decades of meticulous ledgers accumulated upon his desk, he found himself weighing considerably more than frightened voices carried in from the village. For the first time since the summons had been issued, the case rested not only upon fear, but upon reason. And reason, though chofen quieter, had finally begun speaking loudly enough to be heard. The hearing took place on a bitter December morning. the kind of morning when every breath lingered white in the air, and the cold found its way through wool, stone, and timber alike. By the time Isolde arrived at the parish hall, the room was already overflowing. Nearly the whole village had come. Some arrived because they believed justice was finally being done. Others came because scandal was rare enough to interrupt the ordinary rhythm of country life. A handful came quietly, hoping the accusations would prove false. Few admitted that aloud. The hall itself was far too small for so many people. Coats brushed against one another. Boots tracked melting frost across the wooden floor. Low whispers drifted through the crowded room before falling silent as the magistrate entered. At the front stood a long table. On it, Isolde carefully arranged her ledgers, one beside another. Years of careful handwriting, years of patient records, years of work no frightened rumor had ever bothered to examine. Nathan had arrived earlier, deliberately. He had taken a seat at the very back of the room, not beside her, not where anyone could claim his presence influenced the proceedings. They had spoken about it the evening before. However much he wished to stand at her side, the greatest service he could offer her today was restraint. She caught his eye only once. He gave the smallest nod. Nothing more. It was enough. The hearing began. Silas Grieve was called first. The shepherd walked forward with visible confidence. He had repeated his story so many times over the past weeks that memory itself had begun quietly reshaping around the telling. He spoke of moonlight, of the Duke standing beside Isolde beneath the trees. Each detail emerged with slightly more certainty than before, slightly more color, slightly more mystery. By the time he finished, the ordinary conversation he'd once witnessed had become something almost theatrical. The magistrate listened without interruption, occasionally making notes, occasionally asking brief questions, never once allowing opinion to appear on his face.
When Silas returned to his seat, Mrs. Ainsworth was called. The elderly woman walked slowly toward the front. Her grief remained visible long before she spoke. When she began describing the death of her grandson, several people quietly lowered their heads. Others wiped at their eyes. No one doubted her sorrow, least of all Isolde. She had never questioned the woman's pain, only the conclusion that pain had led her toward. Mrs. Ainsworth spoke honestly. She believed Isolde responsible, not because she had seen wrongdoing, not because she possessed proof, but because the timing had seemed impossible to ignore. To a grieving grandmother, coincidence had never felt like coincidence. It had felt like explanation. When she finished, the room had grown very still. Then the magistrate looked toward Isolde. Miss Blackwood. She rose calmly, carrying one ledger in both hands. No one watching her would have guessed how much quiet courage that single walk required. She reached the front of the room, placed the first ledger upon the table, then looked directly at Sir Aldous Whitmore. Her voice never shook, not once. "These records belonged first to my mother." She rested one hand lightly across the worn leather cover. "They have belonged to me these past 3 years." She opened the first page carefully, patiently. Every movement reflected the same steady discipline that had guided her life since Margaret Blackwood's death. "Every remedy I have prepared." She turned another page. "Every family I have treated." Another. "Every payment received." Another. "Every debt still owed."
The room remained silent. She continued, "I have never refused medicine to a sick child because a parent lacked the money to pay." She looked briefly toward the gathered villagers. 41 households represented here received treatment on credit. She gently rested her hand upon the pages. Every one recorded. One by one, she opened additional ledgers. Each told the same story. Dates, names, illnesses, recoveries, occasional losses, honestly recorded, without concealment. Nothing hidden, nothing altered, nothing resembling the fearful stories repeated throughout the parish. The numbers themselves quietly spoke, and numbers, unlike gossip, did not exaggerate. When Isolde finished, Dr. Aldous Fenn stepped forward. The county physician examined the ledgers before offering his testimony. He spoke plainly, without unnecessary flourish. He confirmed the remedies reflected sound medical knowledge. He explained that Margaret Blackwood had long possessed practical skill worthy of respect. He stated that Isolde had continued those methods with equal care. Nothing within the records suggested negligence. Nothing suggested deception. Certainly nothing suggested witchcraft. Finally, the veterinary surgeon followed. He addressed the Pemberton calf. His conclusion proved remarkably simple. The animal's deformity resulted from complications during birth, a side occurrence, an uncommon one, yet entirely natural. No mystery remained once proper examination replaced frightened speculation. Finally, the magistrate himself reviewed the parish burial records. He compared dates, families, illnesses, seasons. The room waited in complete silence. Each page turned slowly beneath his hands. No one spoke, no one moved. Only the occasional crackle from the fire disturbed the stillness. At length, Sir Aldous Whitmore closed the final ledger. He removed his spectacles, folded his hands together, then looked across the crowded room. His voice carried easily through the silence. "I find," he paused briefly, "no substance whatsoever to the charge brought before this court." No one breathed. He continued, "Miss Blackwood's records demonstrate diligence, honesty, and a degree of care for this parish that many here would do well to remember." He looked slowly across the assembled villagers. "I will not condemn a woman upon frightened gossip." He rested one hand upon the ledgers, nor upon coincidence presented as evidence. His decision came simply, clearly. The charge is dismissed. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. No celebration, no applause, no relieved laughter. Only silence, a deep, uncomfortable silence, the kind that settles over people when certainty suddenly collapses beneath them. Many lowered their eyes. Others stared toward the floor. Some seemed unable to decide where to look at all. The story they had carried for 3 long years no longer fit the evidence lying plainly before them. Fear had spoken loudly. Truth had simply spoken longer. At the back of the room, Nathaniel rose. He walked steadily toward the front. This time he did not stop at a respectful distance. He came to stand beside Isolde in full view of the entire parish.
There would be no further caution, no more careful appearances, no more allowing rumor to invent explanations where honesty should have stood. He faced the room, then spoke. "I should have said this sooner." His voice remained calm. "But I believed silence might spare Miss Blackwood further gossip.
A faint, almost regretful smile crossed his face. I was mistaken. He looked around the crowded hall. Silence merely allowed others to write their own version of events. His eyes returned to the villagers. So allow me to speak plainly. I have come to care deeply for Miss Blackwood. The words settled gently through the room. Honestly, respectfully, and entirely of my own choosing. He glanced toward Isolde before continuing. No enchantment brought me to her, no unnatural influence. I found kindness where I expected none, wisdom where others claimed danger, and courage greater than many people fortunate enough never to require it. He looked once more across the room. I will not permit honest affection to be dismissed as sorcery, simply because fear found that explanation more comfortable than examining itself. Silence answered him, yet this silence felt different, not hostile, not accusing, merely thoughtful. Beside him, Isolde turned slowly to meet his eyes. For 3 years she had carried herself with careful restraint, measured words, careful composure, constant readiness for whatever accusation might come next. Standing there, with the charge dismissed, with truth finally spoken aloud, with Nathaniel beside her before the entire parish, she discovered something quietly extraordinary. She no longer needed to hold herself quite so tightly. The hardest winter of her life had finally begun to loosen its grip. The gossip did not disappear overnight. Stories rarely vanish that neatly, but they changed, gradually, almost reluctantly. Fear had been forced to stand beside evidence, and evidence had refused to yield. When spring returned, Mrs. Ainsworth walked alone to the little stone cottage. She carried no accusation this time, only sorrow, and an apology offered plainly without excuse. She admitted that grief had led her toward certainty where none truly existed. Isolde accepted those words with the same quiet grace she had shown throughout the long winter. Few people understood better than she how grief could bend reason until coincidence resembled truth. The following autumn, almost exactly 1 year after the moonlit night beside Hollowwood, Nathaniel and Isolde stood together inside the parish church. Their wedding proved far larger than either had expected. Some guests came from genuine affection, others from curiosity, many from quiet remorse. Whatever their reason, they came. Isolde continued her mother's work. Only now, people entered openly through the front door, no longer ashamed, no longer hiding at kitchen entrances. The ledgers remained, not as protection anymore, simply as the honest record of an honest trade. Even after Ravensworth Hall became her home, Hollowwood remained her favorite place. Nathaniel often walked there beside her in the evenings. Together they returned to the same clearing where they had first met beneath the moonlight. The herbs flourished season after season. Sometimes she tended them beneath the afternoon sun, sometimes beneath the stars. No one troubled themselves over the hour anymore. 3 years after that cold December hearing, she knelt once again with her hands resting in familiar earth. Nathaniel stood beside her, not watching from horseback this time, simply sharing the quiet. She smiled to herself, thinking how strange life could be. Once she measured every word, every step, every glance. Now she needed none of that careful caution. The frightened village had once called her a witch because fear demanded someone convenient to blame. She answered that fear not with anger, but with patience, with truth, with careful records, and with an unwavering refusal to let other people's certainty become her own. In the end, the county remembered her differently, not as the woman they had once feared, but as the woman whose quiet honesty had finally taught them to fear something else instead, their own assumptions. And perhaps that was all the darkness hiding in Hollowwood all along. Not magic, not moonlight, not the woman tending herbs beneath the trees, only fear. And it took one steadfast woman with an honest ledger and one grieving duke willing to see beyond rumor to prove that truth once and for all. If this story stayed with you the way that moonlit clearing stayed with them, comment "The Wood" below. Tell us where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe. The next story is already waiting.